Hello everybody, we're going to have another go at a coloured pencil study, this time of a swan sitting on its nest with the eggs. I photographed this very recently on a local river, so what we're going to try and do, I thought it would be quite fun to do this as a coloured pencil because we can allow the white of the paper to do the work for us on the plumage of the swan. This will actually end up being a fairly limited palette drawing. As you can see, I have sketched the basic outline of my swan to start with. However, for those of you who have to draw out, there's a few things that I'm going to suggest that you look at first. When you're thinking about where to do your drawing on the page, I suggest that you work portrait shaped. That gives you space around. I'm going to fade my background out, so the swan is going to be the main element, part of the nest, and then I'm going to fade the water away and the nest away around the drawing. So I needed to position my swan first, and I started by sketching the front position of the chest, putting a mark down, and that was to the right of centre, and it was also a little bit above the halfway point on the page. So that's where I put the mark for the start of the bird. I then measured the distance across from there to the start of the wing and marked a line for the position of the wing, and that gives me the width of the bird's chest. Once I got that in place, I could then measure the length of the wing coming down and from here to here, and again mark a point for the tip of the wing going that way. Once that was in place, I could then work out where I wanted the back of the bird's neck to be, and then the width across there, so you can start to mark a point. I could measure the distance from here to the bottom of the wing, mark a point, and from here across and mark a point. And then I can sketch the basic outline. Exactly the same over here as well. Look at the angle, hold the pencil along the angle of the neck and think about the time. About 11 o'clock-ish. So I know I've got a line going up, and because I've got the wing here marked in place, I can measure the height from there to the top of the bird's head and mark a point. So once I've got a series of points in place, then I could start drawing a basic outline. But look at where the position of the swan's neck is. You need to get that sort of S curve. So the front of the wing and the back of the bird's neck slightly overlap. So I knew that I could just get that back point marked in, measure the width across the neck and mark a point for the front of the neck. And once you've got those in, you can start to then suggest the outline shape. So it's easier to get a few points marked and use your pencil horizontally and vertically, but also look at angles like time of the hands of a clock to get the angles right. Once the neck's in place, then you could do exactly the same thing to establish the length of the wing up there, the length of the wing down here, and look at where that wing tip is. Hold the pencil horizontally and see where the wing tip is in relationship to this neck of the bird and the top of that wing. And that's how I did it, starting with the chest of the bird, not starting with the top and working down, but going from that position there and going out in different directions. Once the bird's in position, you can suggest where the edges of the nest should be. There's also a post, and I don't want that interrupting the wing of the bird, so I've moved the post to one side. I've also slightly changed the shape of it because I want to get some of the water in down the bottom here. So I've taken a few liberties with the composition. There are a lot of reeds in the water. At this stage, I'm not drawing any of those in. I'll get to that later on, and you can decide how many, or if any, of the reeds that you actually want to go in behind the bird. And then position the eggs around the feet of the bird. Look at the scale of the eggs in comparison to the bird. You can measure, if you're working for photographic reference, you can measure off of the photograph, or just look at it in terms of the scale. Look at the scale of the bird's head and the scale of the eggs, so don't make the eggs sort of dinosaur eggs. Once you've got the basic outline in place in a very light pencil, 2B or HB, lightly sketched, the heavier the pencil work is, the more it'll get picked up by your coloured pencils. Or if you're up to do this in watercolour, it'll show through your watercolour a bit too heavily. So really light pencil sketching. If you can't be that light-handed, once you've done the drawing, very, very lightly use a putty rubber to lift the excess pencil work away. And when we begin to start colouring, we're going to start at the top of the bird, but have a spare piece of paper to cover what you're doing, so that you can move down as you go and you won't smudge your pencil work. Once the basic outline's done, you're ready to go. Right, we're going to start with the head of the bird, and I've selected a few colours to work with. I'm going to use, well, in my box I have this sort of cream colour. I've got yellow ochre and a light orange. So there's a bit more warmth in the colour of the bird at the top. So I'm going to use a combination of these and start to lightly shade. Now that is actually, I can see that's too light, so I'm going to move straight onto my yellow ochre. The cream was too pale. And I'm going to start with the yellow ochre. There is a lot of shadow on the bird, but I'm going to add that afterwards with a series of greys. Now, you will have to mix your colours on the paper depending upon the range of colours that you've got. But remember, we want to leave the white as the white of the paper. So I'm working down the neck of the bird, and I'm going to shade in the direction that I want the feathers to flow. So I'm going to come down. I'm not going to do the neck across like that. I want the neck of the bird to flow downwards. So I'm bringing my ochre very lightly down, holding the pencil halfway down so I can't put too much pressure on the pencil. Now some bits of it, I must admit, I am going to have to come across to keep within my lines, but you can see I've kept my pencil work, and you do pick the pencil work up, so the lighter that you can be, the better. If I sketched any lighter, you wouldn't actually be able to see the outline of the bird on the paper. But I do need a little bit more brightness to the colour, so I'm going to introduce a touch of a sort of a cadmium yellow where the sunlight's hitting the bird's neck. But I'm using the side of not the actual point of the pencil, but the side of the tip, and that gives me a bit more control over what I'm doing, and I can fade the colour out with that, moving down. Now I don't need to bring this yellow too far down the swan's neck, and I am going to start to introduce some grey. So back up to the top of the bird's head, and I can see the grey begins to come in, and I'm going to take it over the top of my yellow that I put down, that yellowy ochre, and it starts to mute the yellow. My pencil line that you can see around the edge, that should get gathered up when I put the dark water in, so that's why I'm not too worried about it. But you can always use the putty rubber, as I said, to remove some strength from your pencil work if you are picking up too much colour from it. I can come underneath the jaw of the bird, and there is some lovely sunlight filtering through, so you can see vague shapes being cast across the bird. So I'm very lightly bring my colour in. There's some shadow being cast down the length of the neck. Now the more textured your paper is that you're working on, the more the grain of the paper will show through. So that's all personal taste. If you want very little paper grain to show through, then you need to use a really, really smooth cartridge paper or hot press watercolour paper. I wouldn't suggest that you use coloured pencils on normal watercolour paper unless you specifically want a heavy grain. I've got a slightly darker grey. I'm quite lucky, I've got a bigger set of pencils, so I can begin to introduce a stronger grey as I come down the bird's neck. But at this stage I'm not going to go in too heavy because it's difficult to judge. We've got white paper all around us, so it's hard to judge how strong you want the tone to be. But I can just begin under the jaw of the bird. I think I need to bring a bit of deeper tone in. The important thing with these pencils is remember to sharpen them to a good point. I find the easiest thing to use actually is this pastel pencil sharpener. Pastel pencil sharpener, they're not that expensive, but I get a really good point with that. So that's the one that I use, which I find gives me the best point. I'm going to go back to my lighter grey, and if you notice, I've changed the angle of my hand now, and I'm starting to shade around the curve of the neck slightly, but still keeping it really, really gentle. Just a little bit of tone around the front of the bird. We can progress further down onto the body of the bird here. Now actually the colour changes to a slightly cooler grey, and it is a little bit deeper, so I can go back to my darker tone. You may only have one grey in your box, and hopefully you do have a grey, and you can then change, warm it and cool it by adding blues. Now I do need to make this a colder grey, so I can bring some blues in, and depending upon how dark I want it to be, I've got a pale sort of almost lilac-y blue which I can bring in over the top of my grey and mix the colour on the paper to give me that cooler colour. And it starts to come across the neck of the bird. I'm turning my hand all the time, I'm almost cross-hatching, but trying to leave some areas of absolute white paper. You can always lose them later, but once they're gone, you've got trouble. It's much harder to get the white paper back. You can by using a putty rubber, so don't panic if you do lose white paper. As long as you've not pressed too hard, you can use a putty rubber and bring the colour back. And I'm going to come around. I can see there's some sort of little bits of detail coming round the side of the bird. I need to go darker here. So I'm back on with my grey again. So all the time I'm overlaying the colour, and I'm starting to come round the shape of the bird's base of the neck, top of the chest. So I'll continue to do this down the body of the bird, round the chest, but before I go too far, I'll also come up into the top of the wings with those same selection of colours. Now that I've got the wing on the right underway, it's not completely finished. I've still got these feathers at the end to build up, but it's hard to know how deep the tones on the shadowed side want to be. So I need to get some balance, and I need to come and work on the left hand wing before I move on to the chest underside, sort of undercarriage of the bird. So I'm going to cover my work and start coming over this side. I've already introduced a little bit of a ochre yellow, and so I started to bring a touch of yellow ochre in just at the top, very pale at the top of the wing. But what I've noticed is there's a bit of pink where the sunlight's catching. There's a little bit of very pale pink, so I'm bringing in a hint, just a suggestion of pink down this front edge of the wing into these long feathers. Really pale, very, very light, just taking the edge off of the white, because don't forget I can always go back and go stronger later. But I've noticed that there's blue catching the back of these feathers as well, so I'm starting to introduce lightly at first, so I can always put more pressure behind the pencil. But in this section of the wing there's a distinct hint of pale blues. So I'm using this sort of lavendery blue and bringing some of that in. Hopefully this will give the effect of a bit of light shading on the back. But what I want to try and do is retain the odd streak of white paper. So I'm not going to do it as a solid shade, but long strokes of the pencil, very lightly, just to bring some of that blue in. I'm bringing the blue, this mauvey blue, in strokes, not completely covering all the blue, but all the white, leaving streaks of white paper to come through, but long strokes coming down the length of the wings. Again, I don't want to go too dark because it's all relative, got to build it up gradually. But I'm just going to bring that suggestion of blue in a few places before I start working on feathers individually. So I think there's some hints of blue further down. It's all light-handed, but strokes in the direction that I want the feathers to fall. So now I'm going to go back up to my greys, start again at the top of the wing, and try and introduce where I can see a little bit of grey tone coming through. So I've got to try and get that wing to look as though it's folding over. At the end of the day, you just have to do a suggestion. Some edges, some little bits of shadow. So it's the shadow that I'm in effect putting in, but at the top of the wing it's fairly light. And then as I come down, so those shadows will get a little bit deeper. You can get lost where you are, but there's quite a lot of shadow being cast just at the top of pale greys. So I tentatively bring those in. I'm not going too heavy, and then I can see where there's a bit of shadow in between each feather, but still leaving some white paper. Shadows, now it changes, I think it's a slightly cooler, more blue grey, so I'm going to go to a colder grey, and there's some shadow being cast by each feather. I think what I need to do is put my grey down and then come across the top with a little bit of that blue again, mixing it on the paper so that I'm getting a slightly colder grey. And then back to my lighter grey, and gradually building it up. Shadows. Some of the shadows are quite sharp edged, so you can get very distinct sort of feather shapes, and that's how I'm going to progress my way down the wing, very, very gently first. As you can see, I've now built the tones up around the chest of the bird, making sure that as I work with the pencils, I'm using the flat side of the pencils and sort of curving round to get that, you know, volume to the chest. I've used blues, greys, ochres, and I've also started to introduce a little bit of a sort of a dark brown and umber brown as well for some of the darker sections. But what I do need to do is use the technique with the little piece of paper where you tear a hole in it, and then I can hold that over the shadowy section on my drawing and then check with the reference, especially if you're using photographic reference, to see whether I've gone dark enough. So I can do that over any section of the picture, like for instance the shadow on the underside of the wing, to see if I've gone deep enough, and if not, I can go back and I can amend that and make it darker. So I will do that constantly, but what I want to start now is beginning to introduce some of the colour around the bird, and I want to do that quite quickly. So I'm going to start off with the sort of reeds that the nest is made of. I'm going to use the flat side of the pencil, and I'm going to start off by putting my ochre colour down to give a bit of warmth, and do this quite fast. I'll go round the eggs and round where the feet of the bird are, and this becomes my base colour into which I can then add other colours. So if I just do a small section here to show you what I mean, I do have some reeds drawn out which are have got green tops to them, so they will be able to sit on top. Actually, because they're a stronger green, I can go right over the top of them. I can introduce other yellows as well, so a bit of my cadmium yellow where I want a variation in colour, slightly warmer colour. I can bring in some cadmium yellow. And then there's hints of light green as well in these reeds where some of them are newer. So I'm just going to sort of do the odd bit of light green coming in. So this nest is purely going to be an impression, but I'm going to start off by building up quick tones on there and then bring in the reeds afterwards. So I'm moving on to a slightly deeper sort of umber tone, and I can bring in some patches, and what I'm going to do is build them up so they're sort of rough lines following the curve that I want to the inside of the nest. So close to the eggs, bring some patches, but I'm not going to lose all of the lighter yellow. You could use some scratching technique if you want to retain some really pale straw. You could indent into the paper, but I'm not going to go into that much detail with this. I'm going to do something that's much more of an impression. So you can work one section at a time as I'm doing, or you can do the entire nest in one go. And once you've started to build up these lines, you can keep on doing that on top of that golden colour that you put down to start with, so that you've got rid of the white of the paper. What I can then do is look at the sort of crisscross reeds in between and gradually start bringing in darker browns, so that you're in effect doing the shadowy bits in between. So I can start introducing little bits of dark browns. Vary the length of your mark and the direction to give the impression of that sort of crisscross of reeds, and go back. I'll go back to my lighter brown and bring some more of those in. But that's how I'm going to sort of tackle this. Otherwise, I mean, you could be here forever with tiny detail, but I'm hoping that just building up these lines, short lines and slightly longer lines, all overlapping but going in the right direction, will give that sort of interwoven impression. And gradually I can build the tones up darker where I need to, closer to the eggs. You can put the colour on the eggs first, or you can come back and do that afterwards, but I can begin to get this straw-like impression, and just coming quite close to the chest of the bird with some of these marks. But all the time looking at your reference to see the direction in which your marks should start. The other thing you can do, you can work on the nest first, or you can begin with the background. Now it depends if you want to have any of the reeds in on the background of what you're doing. So I'm going to cover this over and go to the top of the picture, and if you want to get some reeds in place, you can actually put that in first. So much fatter than you want the reeds to be, you can just do streaks of, if I do one or two, you can do streaks of green where you want the reeds, or you might want the reeds to go into the water, and place those first, and the position of the reflections, so the reflections are slightly ochre, so I can get some of those in place to begin with, and get those where you want them to be, and then you can start bringing your background colours in and around. Now there's really dark around the bird, so I will be coming in
very dark. Now, close to the bird, you've got to be quite sharp with the pencil, good point on the pencil. And I'm not going to do just one colour. I'm going to vary the colours. This is a very deep brown, and this is going to allow me to get a bit of in and out contour on the neck of the bird. It's too smooth at the moment, so I can come in and come quite close to the bird. But what I'm going to try and do when I get into a larger section is make sure that my marks are horizontal, my shading is horizontal on the water, because that way the water is going to lay flat. I don't want to have all my shading going up and down because the water will look like it's tipping towards you. I want it to lay flat. So when I can, once I've been close around the bird, I'm going to start doing my marks horizontally to lay the water flat. It's quite dark fairly close to the bird, but when we get up into these sections around the neck, the water is actually much bluer. This isn't quite the right blue, but I can start bringing in blues and work horizontally. Now, if you don't want to put all the reeds in place, the reeds are quite difficult, so if you don't want to have all the reeds in place, you can ignore them, you can put some in, none in, it's entirely up to you. And if you don't want to put any in, then you can establish your lightest blues first and then go darker on top. But it's up to you how you want to make the swan stand out, but going with fairly deep colours around the swan will bring it out, but we'll build up on that as time goes by.
Now that you can see I've established a lot more of the nest, I'm not going to take my nest right to the edges of the page. I'm just going to have this sort of loose edge to it. I'll probably go back and build this up a little bit more, but I want the main concentration around the swan itself. I've put a few reeds in, I'm not going to put too many, but I've put a few reeds in position, and I've started to bring the first of my colours in behind, a few shades of blue, but you can sort of see here where I've overlaid the blues and the browns and a bit of dark green together. That's the depth of tone that I'm going to need, and that's what's going to throw the swan forward. But I'm going to have a little bit of break from the background and move down to the feet and the eggs. So I've just got a light grey on the legs at the moment, but what I want to do is to bring this dark grey round, and I'm going to use small sort of curved marks to try and get that shape to the swan's legs and feet. So I'm going to take a few marks right round the legs down towards the ankle area, I suppose you'd call it, and then change the direction of my mark and come across the webbed foot. I'll try and give the impression that the swan's feet are flat on the base of the nest, so I can see a few of the sort of kind of sinews to the foot, so I'll come round, and then it disappears into the reeds on the nest, so I'm not going to define it too much, just have a little bit more of the lines coming round. I think I need to press a bit harder, get a bit slightly deeper tone on part of the foot. Move on to the second one, making sure I cover my work as I go so that I'm not running my hands through the pencil work that's already down. It can only be an impression, I can't see a huge amount of detail going on as the feet kind of disappear behind the eggs, but this one has got its part of the webbed foot is actually over one of the eggs, so I'm going to deepen the grey and grade it out to make it look like it's curving round, so it's quite dark close to the egg in the foreground, and then lightens off as it comes around, and hopefully that will give the impression that the foot is going over. and then the actual top of that toe is a bit darker. Slightly darker line on top. And then I need to grade this in a bit, it's not so light. I'm going to lose that. It's all about the amount of pressure you're putting behind the pencil. And I want to have a little bit of texture, so even in the dark sections I'm going to take some lines going round the foot. I just need to darken the arch. And there's a bit of a claw on the tip of that one. Right. Now I need to move on to the eggs, and they are quite pale. I'm just going to put a quick cream base down. And as I go, I can adapt the shape because you can't help but distort the shape as you go. So I may have to just adapt it slightly. So if I put a bit of this is like a light ochre cream colour down, but that doesn't give the eggs any 3 dimension at all. They're still quite flat. So if I just show you on one of them, if I take my light grey and I start to build up some light grey all the time, I'm flicking my eyes from the reference to my drawing and looking to see where the lightened shade falls. And in this instance, it's deeper on the left of the eggs, light falling on the right, and then just a bit of tone, changing the direction of my shading. A little bit of tone coming around the sides. And then what will make the egg actually sit back is the tone around it. So if I just show you some dark shadow falling on the other egg that it's overlapping, you begin to see the shape coming through, and there's dark shadow coming round. In fact, I do need to bring a little bit more tone, very gently around the front of the egg, and then I can go quite dark, sort of in between. And you begin to get the impression of the egg in 3 dimensions, so I need to do that for each single egg. We're on the home stretch with this now. I mean, there is a lot more I could do. I could carry on with the nest in the foreground and go darker and add more detail, but I quite like it fading off. I sort of might do a little bit more around the front, but I'm sort of nearly there. I've got some more that I could do with the reeds at the back, but I'm just going to concentrate on the final details now. So back to the face of the bird, and I'm going to concentrate on the beak area. So covering the rest of my picture, I've got a selection of a couple of oranges, pale light orange and a much stronger orange, all mixed to sharpened to a really good point. And I'm going to put those in place first, with the lightest orange going down to begin with over the beak area, and that becomes my base colour. It needs to fade out towards the tip of the beak because it gets very, very pale there, so I'm just going to lift the pressure off the pencil so it's faded, and then I can come in with my stronger orange and just very lightly going down the length of the beak, start to work in this deeper colour so that we're blending it on top. And again, that just, the pressure, I'm not pressing very hard at all. I'm just doing short strokes with the pencil towards the tip of the beak. That's as much as I'm going to do on that for the moment, because what I want to do is to work on the face of the bird next. Now, I know it looks black around the eye area, but if I put some blue in first, I'm not going to press too hard, but I'm going to put a blue base down first, and then I'll go on top with black coloured pencil. And that should make a much richer colour. The only thing that I do have to do is there's light catching on that front section, so I'm just going to fade the blue out before I get there, and then swap to my black pencil. These are all sharpened to a really, really good point. I want a tiny bit of light to fall on the top of the eye, so I'm going to leave some of the blue exposed, so that there's almost a highlight in the eye. It doesn't matter if you leave sections out at this stage, because you can go back later and lose them, but it's much more difficult to try and pull them back afterwards. So the dark needs to come round the side of the beak. And that's why I've got such a good point, because I'm putting very fine lines in, and with the absolute tip of the pencil, the dark line runs all the way, really finely, down the side of the beak and to the front, and then not pressing so hard, you get that little marking on the tip of the beak. It's not so black, so I'm not pressing as hard, and just the underside of the beak a little bit firmer, and then at the top, the base of the beak, we've got this dark, and it's got to look 3D, so I need to make it look rounded. Just fading that colour across so that it goes to a light grey as it comes across. Dark over the top of the eye. Round the tone. Across. Doing this quite carefully, it's quite a small area, so I don't want to go over my lines. But I'll go back now and press harder on this section to make it deeper. So it's just pressure, it's not changing the colour at all, there's just more pressure with the pencil to deepen that section. I can then see that I need to work some more of the stronger orange at the base of the beak. And let that fade down. And there's a few other minor adjustments that I would make now that I've got some tone on there. I'm looking at the neck of the head of the bird, and I think I might even go back in with my light grey and just get some more tone underneath that chin area. Darken that down a bit more. And round away from the eye. Just slightly make it a little bit darker. Give a bit more 3-dimension to the head of the bird. A bit more coming down the back of the neck. It's got these little ruffs where the feathers are short. It can give the impression of a few, the light or the shadows coming round the neck, help with the shape slightly. There's a few other little bits and pieces that I would do, but by and large, that's most of that section. Other little finishing touches, I've noticed a couple of feathers down here which should be in the shadows, but it's quite a blue shadow, so I'm going in with my light blue and just knocking those back so that they still look light but not as bright. And you can go over the picture and continue to make little adjustments, darkening things down, lightening things up. I need to make sure that where the feet of the bird and the eggs are, that I've got the tones dark enough around that. So there's a little bit of adjustment that I'll probably do on those. But basically, we're finished.